Thanks to you both. Next, want to ask Trent Rhorer to come up, for Director of HSA. HSA is obviously integrally involved in this from a city perspective, and Trent, want to thank you for all of your leadership. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure, Supervisors. Trent Rhorer, Director of Human Services Agency. Nice to see you all again. We're loading up the presentation now. So what I'm going to attempt to do today is give you an overview of the housing that's in HSA's portfolio, talk to you a little bit about how homeless families and individuals access that housing, how they're referred and how they get into the housing, and then attempt to lay out the funding structure, which is a new one that's going to begin July of this year, July of 2014. And this was a new funding structure around how we fund and the amount of funding for services in supportive housing. And this was done at the request of the Human Services Commission in an attempt to bring a little bit more rationality to how we fund these thousands of units in terms of services. So the first slide, there we go. I believe you saw this last week when Joyce Crum presented to you all, but I just thought it was a good intro slide. So the total number of units that are currently funded under HSA are a little over 3,751 to be exact, 3,359 single adult, and then 392 family units. Over on the left is an attempt to break down either sort of the funding source or type of unit. You can see under the SRO Master Lease Program, Single Room Occupancy Hotel Master Lease Program, we have the Care Not Cash funded units through the Care Fund and Proposition N, the non-Care Not Cash units, and then we have a pilot program that's with HUD dollars, and this is the program at 5th and Harrison that Bevan Dufty referenced. And it's good that we broke this out because this is really an attempt, since the topic of today's hearing is around a housing ladder, this is a pilot project that is attempting to look at the type, range, and amount of services that might be necessary in order to sort of get positive exits out of supportive housing. And this one's particularly targeted to youth, but the idea is a stronger workforce component, stronger sort of participation in case planning to see if these folks can actually succeed, increase their income, and access either a different sort of affordable unit or perhaps even a market rate unit in the city or the Bay Area. The next group of units, Shelter Plus Care, these are federally funded by HUD units targeted at the chronically homeless. And then the newest, which is a partnership with Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development, is our local operating subsidy program, where we have general funds that support the services and operations in our units. So that gives you a good sense of sort of the universe we're talking about when we talk about the housing ladder and strategies and potentially challenges to implementing a housing ladder within the HSA units. So close to 4,000 units we're talking about. So it's important to note and talk a bit about how homeless folks access these units, because it gives you a sense on the population we're drawing from and sort of help the discussion on what types of services and, again, the amount of services that should be in these supportive housing buildings. So for the adult single room occupancy and local operating subsidy or LOSP units, the access points are listed below. There's 5 of them. Adult emergency shelters, resource centers and drop-in centers, the HOT team, homeless outreach team. For the Care Not Cash funded units, those come through our public assistance program for single adults, which is CAP, which is the County Adult Assistance Program, and then other identified nonprofits that serve this target population. So folks who are referred in and access these units are, generally right from the street or shelter system. So generally, we're talking about, although not necessarily chronically homeless, they may not have been on the street for that long, but we know that they are certainly income challenged and everything that sort of comes along with that in terms of low job skills, typically potentially treatment or addiction or substance abuse issues that we deal with. So,
quick question for you. I think one of the ideas out there that we don't have in San Francisco that some other cities have is this concept of a central intake center. we have multiple referral points. Different agencies have that as well. I think different people have different opinions on it. Can you maybe talk about kind of whether that may or may not work, or pluses and minuses from your perspective?
Sure. So the notion of a single sort of intake center came from a visit that we made to Philadelphia probably a decade ago. And it really was targeted to folks who were on the street. In Philadelphia, a lot of it was triggered by weather. They had hot weather protocols and cold weather protocols in it, and would allow public entities who are interacting with homeless folks on the street, so outreach teams like our HOT team, police, EMS, so emergency medical services, ambulances. It allowed them a central place to bring folks rather than sort of looking for where there might be space. And the idea of the central service center, central access point, was sort of a low-level initial assessment and then a look across the spectrum of Philadelphia's options, and this is shelter, and then transportation to one of those. I haven't visited the Philadelphia model in a while. I think Amanda has done a little bit of more research on it. I think some of the benefits might be it would give folks on the street another resource, or potentially a permanent resource to bring someone. So when they're interacting, rather than saying, well, you can call 311 and maybe get a shelter bed, or we might have a treatment bed for you in a couple weeks, it would give them a place to come indoors immediately. And whether that's in a bed or a chair, but at least a place to go indoors during the day and even the evening to get out of the elements, but also to get assessed and get placed out into the system in maybe a more coordinated manner. So that's the idea around that. So moving on to families, how do homeless families get into supportive housing? We use what are called access point agencies. APA is the acronym, and there are 19 CBOs that provide either manage the emergency shelter wait list, the family emergency shelters, DV shelters, transitional housing, and then standalone non-residential programs that are assisting families. And the APAs help with the families completing the applications and navigating that process to get one of the units. And in both of these systems, referral systems, there are no waiting lists. It's sort of done on a rotational basis by access point, which, given sort of the dynamic nature of the population, I think makes a lot more sense than trying to manage a wait list that would quickly get stale. So the next few slides are talking about the funding structure, and this, I think the takeaway that I'd like for you all and for the public and our community-based partners is the level we're currently funded at in the budget to provide supportive services and operational dollars, but this is really about the services piece. If we're looking at a housing ladder approach, and housing ladder sort of defined as getting positive exits as a result of increase in income or increase in improvement in life circumstances in another way that allows a family or a single adult to move out of supportive housing. I think we want to have the discussion on whether or not the current level of funding, HSA-wide and even citywide, is adequate to provide those supports. And I think the pilot at 5th and Harrison will help us a little bit. And I'll touch on the controller's study that's going on now, which also I think will help give us a little more information on what sort of the right mix is. So let me at least first tell you where we're at. As I said earlier, it was created at the direction of the Human Services Commission, where they got to a point where they were approving contracts for supportive services where the per unit cost of the services were varying wildly, from a high of, say, $8,000 a unit to a low of $900 per unit, and everywhere in between. And there wasn't any real rationality to it. And that was sort of a byproduct of the way the system evolved and expanded, and where we'd be negotiating with single nonprofit entities around what the service mix should be without any sort of standards or sort of metrics to look at. Or boilerplate. And so it just sort of came about as a process of negotiation, and even sometimes a process of, well, this is how much we have in the budget, so let's find a service mix that matches that. So what we attempted to do is look at a structure that kind of was based on the type and level of service at each of our buildings, and that was informed by either past staffing patterns at a building or the population that was going into the building. And so I'll walk you through those. And again, this was done through an RFP process that we just concluded. We haven't, I don't even think, begun negotiations yet, but the idea is The contracts will begin July 1 of this year. So what we came up with, and this was based on surveys of our supportive housing providers and data we had internally, and budget figures as well. We came up with 5 tiers. The first tier is for what we call step-up master lease buildings, and then buildings where we don't control the placements. HSA does not control the placements. So Model A step-up master lease, and this is for single adults. The idea here is it would be targeted to tenants who have been in the larger master lease program for a period of time and have been a successful tenant. And the proxy there is sort of a successful tenant, a stable tenant may need a less service-rich environment in order to be in the building. Model B, under Tier 1, is non-placement units in buildings. And this is buildings where HSA does not control the access points. So I walked you through the single adult access points and the family access points, and sort of, either directly from the street, directly from shelter. And although many of the folks who are being placed in these buildings may be from those areas, there also are a mix of tenants in those buildings who have been there quite a long time. A lot of these buildings have been online for 10, 15 years with not entirely stable, but a core of stable population that may need a less deep, sort of array of services. And that was sort of the thinking around that. And then you can see on the last line, which is, I think, the most important, when you break it down based on this tier, what you're looking at is support service staff to unit ratio. So support service staff is basically, let's call them a case manager, right? For the adult units, you're looking at 1 case manager or 1 FTE for 75 people, 75 units. And then on the family units, it's 1 to 50. Again, the notion is folks may need less deep services in these buildings. It may not necessarily be the case in all these buildings, but that's sort of the idea. In Tier 2, what we're calling moderate support services tier for master lease buildings. And this is where HSA does the placement, and we fund the leasing and the operations and the support services. We do the referral and placement. And the support services staff unit ratio here, and these are all single adult buildings, is 1 to 50, as compared to 1 to 75 in Tier 1. In Tier 3, these are the HSA master lease buildings, again, where we do the placement and the referral and the placement, where where there are stronger support services that we feel are necessary and that we're funding and that the providers applied to. Again, sort of important to remind you that this was done through an RFP process, so our supportive housing providers were asked to propose what tier they were going to be funded at. So this is driven by the providers' proposals, largely. In these stronger support services building, you're looking at 1 FTE for 35 adult units. I should say on the 1 to 35, that doesn't necessarily, and the 1 to 50 and the 1 to 75 doesn't necessarily represent a caseload, because we have different levels of sort of uptake of case management services. Some folks in the buildings may choose not to engage at all, may feel they're fine. There may be other reasons they're not engaging, and then sort of the residual population would be those who access. So you're looking at sort of the case manager per unit rather than case manager per client or per tenant.
But it's kind of a proxy in a way.
It is, but we don't have 100% uptake of services in our buildings. So the controller's study is going to attempt to get at what that actual utilization rate is to help us better sort of define and think about support services patterns. So Tier 4 is several types of buildings. So our local operating subsidy program, the HUD supportive housing program, and then shelter plus care. Moderate need, we're calling it, for single adults and for families. We're doing the referral and placement here. The eligibility criteria for these Tier 4 buildings does not require, and this is distinct from Tier 5, which I'll talk about, but it does not require all the referrals to be chronically homeless or to have a certification of disability. And so some may be, but not all of them are necessarily the quote-unquote chronic homeless. And the service staff to unit ratio in the moderate need in this set of buildings is 1 to 25, both for adult and for families. And then Tier 5, it's the same mix of buildings, but we're framing this as the high need adult and family. And this is buildings where the eligibility criteria does require all referrals to be chronically homeless and have a certification of disability. Or 100% of the building is a local operating subsidy building, which is the general fund in partnership with Mayor's Office of Housing. So we fund support services here and additional funding for staff that have higher training or skills, meaning sort of a higher level of case management acumen, either experience or social work backgrounds, that sort of thing. And in this, the ratio is 1 to 25 as well. And what we're asking here, generally families and adults in these buildings would be a more active engagement in case management planning and that sort of thing. So the next, and Bevan did a nice job, and Amanda did a nice job of describing coordinated assessment, so I won't go through them. I'll only say that we're beginning the pilot in July on our S+C building, shelter plus care buildings, and it is a requirement for the HUD-funded buildings. We do think, we agree with Amanda and Bevan that we think it'll be a really good tool to assess sort of the service need of folks and to make sure that we're really getting the chronically homeless into the buildings, or folks that are in most need. Which leads into to the national goal of ending chronic homelessness by December 31st, 2016, which is a laudable and high goal. The strategy that's recommended, of course, is prioritize chronically homeless people for placement in supportive housing. And then I added the third bullet for this hearing because I think, given the number of units we have in our portfolio in the city, sort of DPA, Department of Public Health, and us, if we're successful at creating a housing ladder and, again, getting positive exits out of our buildings, it obviously will accelerate the placement of chronically homeless individuals and get them to access those services and to cycle out. When we were developing this robust system, a decade and a half ago or more, we were talking a bit about thinking about it as both housing first, but also permanent supportive housing, sort of. And by saying permanent, what we mean is they have tenants' rights. It's their permanent housing. It's not a transitional program. It's permanent. But it can also be construed as it's permanent housing as it's in the last sort of housing for this individual or this family. It's where they're going to be the rest of their life. It's permanent for them. And although that may be the case for some, I think now as we sort of think about it more, there are opportunities for exits. And while they do have tenants' rights and it's permanent, maybe we want to think about the service mix as more of a transitional housing model. Not to say they folks move out after 12, 18 months, but it's more of a program that folks come into our buildings. And again, I'm just throwing out ideas to discuss. Maybe folks enter the program knowing they have tenants' rights, but also knowing that they're entering a program that requires a certain level of engagement. What that looks like, I think, would be a nice dialogue with our providers and clients and you all. But, whether it's volunteer activities or employment training or treatment or applying for disability, getting on benefits, sort of the whole range of things that we think would lead to positive, improvements in people's lives and getting them out of permanent housing to open up another unit for someone who's chronically homeless. So
Mr. Rhorer, a few quick questions.
Yeah.
So in that vein, I think what I've heard from a lot of the providers as well is sometimes we have the supportive housing services, but for one reason or another, we don't have the tenants within those services actually become part of our street population during the day, if you will, and add to this kind of public exacerbation around homelessness, mm-hmm. which I don't think is healthy because we want to really help people get off the streets and focus on those people. But if we're publicly funding units, but they're then during the day or at night or what have you, out on the streets. You mentioned some ideas. I mean, any other thoughts around that? Has that been the case for a while? And again, I've just heard that sentiment from people. Yeah. No data around that, but heard it from providers, housing providers as well. So yeah. I imagine that's at least to some degree the case.
I think that's right, and I think when you look at placing thousands of people in permanent supportive housing, and you look at sort of the funding levels I just walked you through, where in some buildings it's 1 to 75 or 1 to 50. Right. If everyone were to uptake case management services in those buildings, those case managers couldn't handle that caseload. 1 to 75, given the depth of need for a lot of these tenants, it's just not possible to provide that rich sort of case management and service coordination and that sort of thing. So for those reasons, I think that some of our tenants and, our providers, that I've talked to agree, some of our tenants, they don't have any activities during the day. And it's an unrealistic expectation that someone's going to stay in his or her room all day. That's just not, no one would do that. No one would want them to do that.
Right.
So, community activities in the building, things that would engage folks, either in the community or in the building, rather than being idle, and subject to, their disease of addiction, mental illness, and, maybe panhandling during the day, maybe being on the street, which sort of in the macro view of your, when you hear about your citizenry complaining about homelessness, well, some of the complaints really isn't homelessness. It's they're in housing, but it's sort of a level of activity during the day that maybe we're either not able to provide or folks aren't uptaking. And so, there's sort of two ways to go about this, or maybe even a combination. I mean, you can develop rich, and we've seen this in our buildings, right? A rich array of services, a really healthy community in our buildings where tenants know each other and it's really vibrant. And then you have other buildings where maybe that's not as much the case. And sometimes that's because you have really good case managers or more of them, and sometimes it's, and so, might we think about some sort of requirement in exchange for, this rich subsidy in housing and the permanent nature of the housing, that 10 hours of activity a week, and maybe that will help breed a little more community and a little more involvement among the tenants. We do that we're required to do that in our welfare to work programs, and a lot of families who haven't engaged for a very, very long time in our system, once they see the types of services that they're not only required to engage in, but that we offer, it really has a positive impact. It's getting childcare, it's employment training, it's getting a job, it's going to treatment and improving their lives. And so, again, I'm just throwing out sort of different ideas based on the world that Human Services funds and operates, just for thinking around how do we improve engagement. So, better and more rich services and perhaps, a higher expectation on what our tenants should be doing in housing.
So, and one of the things that was mentioned before, we have some people in our shelter system. I think we talk about the aging within our shelter system as well. Certainly a critical issue as we talk about medical needs and funding those. But then there's also the concept that there are some people that have been in our shelter. As you think about the housing ladder, again, keep drawing back to this hearing. The housing ladder, the idea is you want people to keep climbing up the ladder to make space available for the people that are currently on our streets, and having it clogged up makes no sense at all, obviously, thematically. Right. So I've heard there is not enough supportive housing inventory there to push people along, which is an issue.
Sure.
And then you also hear that some people don't want to leave. Maybe they found community in where they are. People have been in a shelter 2 years, 7 years. I mean, shocking when you hear those numbers for the first time. Truth in that there are these super long-term shelter stayers, and how do we encourage that and kind of unclog that part of our system?
Both Bevan and Amanda mentioned it. There is a cohort of folks who are quote-unquote long-term stayers in shelter. We've actually run the data, and I wish I would have brought it with me. I don't know if you guys know. Okay. I'll give you sort of an example, and then we can maybe extrapolate that to some of the whole. When we opened, thanks, Amanda. When we opened, I'm looking at the data now as I'm speaking. So 4%. Let's just do the data, and then I'll talk a little bit about potential strategies. So if you look at the number of bed nights over the last 2 years, so 365 times 2, so there's over 700 bed nights over the last 2 years that are possible. 4% of our current shelter population has been in that bed for over 700 bed nights over the last 2 years. Another 5% has experienced 600 to 700 bed nights. Another 5% 500 to 600, and then another 5% 400 to 500. So that's almost 20%. You could categorize as sort of the longer term stayers. Mm-hmm. We can go further and sort of correlate that by age and gender and all that, and we do that and sort of look at what population we're talking about. But when we opened the Ramon Hotel in 2006 or 2007, and this is a building that was it was burned out, so it was completely refurbished, brand new construction or renovation. Nice roof deck, really nice building. It was on Howard, and I think it's Howard in between 6th and 7th. when we were offering the opportunity for seniors to go into those buildings, and the rent, if a senior was on SSI at the time, the rent would have been about 35% of their income. Many of them said that they didn't want it. And for those reasons, Supervisor, that you highlighted, sort of, I've built community in my shelter, I've been in this bed a long time, it's sort of my space now, I'm not paying rent, I'm getting my meals prepared. And it wasn't until we actually took a van to the shelter and actually drove folks, prospective tenants, to the building to have them walk through it and walk through the buildings and the natural light and the roof deck, that people said, oh, well, actually, we still had some say no, but it sort of opened their eyes to really what we're talking about when we're saying housing. And so I tell you this because I think it leads to a few explanations. And one is perhaps a misunderstanding among longer-term shelter stayers, many of whom are seniors or women, about what the supportive housing program really is. Sort of maybe the picture of them is an SRO that's, in the middle of the tenderloin, that has no support services and is sort of dilapidated, and maybe that's the vision that folks have in mind, and they're like, I don't want that, and who could blame them? But that's not the reality. When we bring housing online, it's rehabbed, it's brought up to code. We require the building owners to upgrade all the systems. We have 24-hour desk clerks. We have support services, so they're good environments. So that, I think, is part of it. I think part of it is not wanting to spend any of their income. SSI right now is about $875 a month, I think. That's obviously not a lot, and they don't get food stamps because SSI folks in California are not eligible for food stamps. So that's the income. And even though it's 35% of their income to pay rent, it leaves them with, a little under $500. And so that's probably a barrier. So what are possible solutions, sort of, in the world of sticks and carrots? The carrot is a nice housing unit that's yours forever as long as you pay your 35% of income in rent, with services on site and a nice senior community. If you're offered that once, twice, and turn it down, maybe you lose access to your long-term bed. And so maybe that will incentivize some behavior to take up what we think is better for them, and certainly provide an opening in the shelter system. And better outcomes for that individual. If that was sort of the alternative, that no longer could they stay there indefinitely in the shelter, maybe they would take it up more. There was thrown around, this is a long time ago, 7, 8, 9 years ago, when the Social Security Administration came to us and said, well, folks are on SSI, if they're receiving shelter and food, you're actually supposed to be charging them per the SSI regulations. We never went there. It was administratively difficult, cumbersome. We didn't think it was sort of the best way to go. But perhaps if shelter stayers were required to pay a little bit towards contributing to the food and the shelter that's there, after they've been offered, again, 1, 2, 3 times housing, maybe that's another sort of incentive to take the housing up.
So is that I never heard that before. Is that a current regulation, actually?
It is,
or is it glossed over?
It's a current reg, but it can be interpreted to mean either permanent housing that's providing meals, or shelter, and sort of the notion of emergency shelter was kind of the wiggle room out of that.
Got it.
But when you look at someone who's been in shelter 2 years, it's not really emergency; it is permanent. So,
okay, thanks. Thank you.
And then I'll just conclude with sort of our effort to get more data and information to inform what a housing ladder might look like in our buildings is our controller's study of our HSA permanent supportive housing units. It's currently underway. The final report will be in the fall. What we're looking at is resident service utilization, which I spoke to earlier. Sort of what are the service needs? Are they linking to services? Do they follow through on referrals? Are they even accessing services in the building? The trajectory of residents. So what are we really talking about? How long have clients stayed on average in permanent supportive housing? Have the client's needs changed over time? Is our service mix there now totally a mismatch with what's going on? And then the client outcomes after exiting supportive housing are important as well. So what is a positive exit? How many exit every year? Where do they go? Who are those who are exiting? Are these the employables? Are these the folks on SSI? Are these folks with roommates, with connections in the community, all that sort of stuff? So we're looking forward to that, to really further our dialogue both internally and with our community partners, and of course with the board.
Okay.
So I'll conclude with that, and
Thank you very much.
questions.
Colleagues, any questions at this time for Mr. Rhorer? Okay. Thank you for your presentation. Much appreciated. So next we have Margot Antonetti, Director of Housing and Urban Health for DPH. Thank you for being here.
Sure. Good morning, supervisors. So we're here